The moment the USB clicked into place, the atmosphere in the conference room shifted in a way no one could ignore. The screen on the wall flickered once, then stabilized into a simple loading interface, casting a cold glow across the polished wood and glass surfaces. Emma Carter did not move. She stood quietly near the table, her small frame contrasting sharply with the surrounding presence of 7 seasoned lawyers and one of the most powerful men in the room, William Carter. Jonathan Reed stepped forward slightly, his voice low but controlled. "Mr. Carter, I strongly advise we pause this and verify the source before proceeding. We are dealing with sensitive corporate material, and we cannot assume its authenticity without review." But William did not take his eyes off the screen. His expression was no longer purely analytical. There was something else there now, something restrained and unspoken, as if he was weighing not just the file but the consequences of having it exist at all. Emma broke the silence again, her voice calm but firm. "You already know what is inside it. That is why everyone in this room is afraid to open it." A subtle reaction passed through the lawyers. One of them adjusted his glasses. Another shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one denied her words. Instead, they avoided them. The loading bar progressed slowly across the screen, each percentage mark feeling heavier than the last. Outside the glass walls, the city of Chicago moved on with its usual rhythm, unaware that inside this room, something foundational was beginning to crack. William finally leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "Emma," he said quietly, using her name for the first time, "if you are wrong about this, there will be consequences you may not understand." Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "If I am wrong," she replied, "then nothing changes. But if I am right, everything already has." Jonathan Reed exhaled sharply, glancing toward the other lawyers as if searching for support, but none came. The room that had once been filled with confident legal certainty now felt like a space suspended between truth and denial. The screen blinked again. A folder opened. Subfolders appeared. Names scrolled briefly before freezing on one highlighted file. No one spoke. William's hand moved slightly, hovering near the trackpad, then stopping again. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough to be noticed by everyone in the room. Emma took a small step closer to the table. "You built your entire argument on silence," she said softly. "But silence does not erase what happened. It only waits for someone to open it." Jonathan's voice rose slightly, tighter now. "This is not appropriate. She is a child. We cannot allow her to dictate the direction of this meeting." But William raised his hand slightly, not to silence Emma, but to silence Jonathan. The gesture alone changed the balance in the room. The lawyers went still again. William looked at the screen, then at Emma, then back at the screen. Something in his expression shifted, not into fear, but into recognition. As if some part of him had already known this moment would come, even if he had spent years avoiding it. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his finger on the trackpad. The file opened, and in that instant the room stopped breathing. The file opened with a soft digital chime that felt far too ordinary for what it carried, and for a brief moment nothing appeared on the screen except a simple folder title labeled Internal Compliance Archive 2019. Then the first document loaded, and the atmosphere in the room changed so sharply it felt as if the air had become heavier. Emma Carter did not move, her eyes fixed on the screen as if she already knew exactly what would appear. William Carter leaned slightly forward, his jaw tightening, while Jonathan Reed instinctively took a half-step closer to the monitor. The first page displayed financial summaries, contracts, and internal notes, but not the official versions that had been presented in previous board reviews. These were annotated, revised, and marked with timestamps that suggested deliberate alterations over time. A lawyer seated near the far end of the table whispered under his breath, "This cannot be real," but no one contradicted what they were seeing. The screen scrolled automatically, revealing structured discrepancies between approved documents and original drafts. Emma finally spoke, her voice steady but quiet. "You told the court those records were never changed." The words were not loud, but they landed with precision. William did not answer immediately. His eyes remained locked on the screen, absorbing each line as if trying to reconstruct reality in real time. Jonathan cleared his throat again, though his earlier confidence had thinned into something far more cautious. "We need to verify the chain of custody for these files," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Another lawyer leaned in closer to read a highlighted section, his expression tightening as he recognized signature patterns that should not have been altered. The room, once defined by authority and control, now felt like a space held together only by hesitation. Emma stepped slightly closer to the table, her small voice cutting through the silence again. "You built arguments around versions that were edited after the fact," she said. "That is why they kept saying no one could prove it." William finally looked at her directly, not as a child now, but as the source of an undeniable disruption. "Where did you get access to this?" he asked, his voice controlled but no longer distant. Emma hesitated for the first time, just for a second, then answered simply, "I did not get it. It was left where I could find it." That answer shifted the room again, introducing uncertainty where there had previously been only suspicion. The file continued to scroll, revealing communication logs, internal approvals, and marked revisions that suggested coordinated decision-making across multiple departments. Jonathan Reed straightened slightly, as if trying to reclaim structure from chaos. "Even if these documents are authentic," he said carefully, "context matters. Without full verification, this could be misinterpreted." But William raised a hand again, not to silence him this time, but to pause him. His gaze remained fixed on a particular section of the screen, where a series of authorization signatures appeared in sequence. He studied them for several seconds without speaking. The room waited. Even the sound of the ventilation system seemed noticeable now. Emma watched him closely, her expression unchanged. Finally, William spoke again, quieter this time. "These signatures," he said slowly, "are not supposed to exist in the same timeline." No one responded, because in that moment, everyone in the room understood that this was no longer about interpretation. It was about exposure, and the truth, once visible, does not wait for permission. The words from William Carter hung in the air longer than anyone in the room expected, as if even the building itself was processing what had just been said.
Impossible timeline signature.
The phrase repeated silently in the minds of everyone present, stripping away the last layers of certainty they had held onto just minutes before. Jonathan Reed was the first to move, stepping closer to the screen as though proximity alone could restore order. "There may be an explanation," he said carefully, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Version control errors are not uncommon in complex corporate systems. We should not assume intent without a full forensic audit." But even as he spoke, his eyes did not fully leave the screen. Emma Carter remained still, watching the adults around her with a calm that felt increasingly out of place in the collapsing structure of their confidence. William Carter leaned back slightly, his hands no longer resting on the table but loosely clasped together, as if he was trying to contain something that was no longer fully under his control. "Errors do not align signatures across 3 separate departments," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The room shifted again. One of the lawyers, a younger associate seated near the corner, reached for a printed copy of earlier filings and began comparing them line by line with what was displayed on the screen. His expression changed subtly as he moved through each section, recognizing patterns that contradicted everything he had been taught to trust. "These approvals," he said hesitantly, "they match internal routing logs that were never included in discovery submissions." The statement landed heavily. Jonathan turned toward him, sharply. "You are making assumptions based on incomplete data," he replied, but the edge in his voice was beginning to fracture. Emma finally spoke again, her voice steady but soft. "It is not incomplete," she said. "It is just the part you were not supposed to see." William's gaze shifted back to her. This time, there was no distance in his expression, only focus. "Why would anyone leave this accessible?" he asked. "And why would they leave it where you could find it?" Emma hesitated briefly, then answered in the simplest way she could. Because they thought no one would believe me. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer tense with anticipation. It was heavy with recognition. Jonathan looked between William and Emma, his earlier authority now replaced with a more careful uncertainty. Even if this is accurate, he said slowly, we are still dealing with internal documentation. It does not automatically indicate wrongdoing. There are legal interpretations that must be considered before drawing conclusions. But William did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached toward the keyboard and scrolled further down the file. New sections appeared. Communication threads. Time-stamped revisions. Authorization chains that linked names across departments in ways that should not have intersected. His expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to realization. These are not isolated inconsistencies, he said finally. This is structured. The words settled over the room like a weight no one could ignore. Emma looked at him then, her voice quieter than before. That is why I told you first, she said. Because once you see it, you cannot pretend it was never there. No one spoke after that. The lawyers no longer looked at each other for reassurance. The screen continued to glow, indifferent to the silence it had created. As the truth inside it waited patiently for the next decision that no one in the room seemed ready to make. The silence in the conference room did not break immediately after Emma Carter's words. Instead, it stretched, fragile and uncertain, as if every person present was waiting for someone else to restore the version of reality they had lost. William Carter remained seated, his eyes fixed on the screen, but his focus was no longer on the data alone. It was on the structure behind it, the invisible architecture of decisions that had been exposed line by line. Jonathan Reed finally stepped back from the monitor, exhaling slowly as he tried to regain professional control over a situation that no longer responded to it. We cannot proceed further without pausing and initiating a full internal compliance review, he said, his voice measured but noticeably restrained. This is now beyond the scope of this meeting. One of the senior lawyers nodded quickly, reaching for his tablet as if administrative action could contain what was unfolding. Another began speaking quietly into a phone, requesting immediate technical verification support. But none of these actions changed the atmosphere in the room. Emma stood where she had been since the beginning, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, as though she had already accepted everything that was happening long before anyone else understood it. William finally turned away from the screen and looked at her directly. You said someone left this for you to find, he said slowly. Emma nodded once. Yes. His gaze tightened slightly. Why would anyone choose you? For the first time since the file opened, Emma hesitated. Not in fear, but in thought, as if selecting words that had already been prepared long before this moment. Because adults look for permission, she said quietly. Children look for patterns. The sentence landed without interruption. Jonathan Reed shifted his weight, visibly unsettled now, while the other lawyers exchanged brief glances that no longer carried confidence. William leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. You understand what this means, he said. If this is verified, it will not stay contained within this room. Emma looked at him directly. That is why it was never meant to stay contained. The words were simple, but they changed the tone again. The screen behind them continued to display the layered documentation, now scrolling through communication records that connected decisions across multiple departments and time periods. Each entry seemed harmless on its own, but together they formed a pattern that no longer allowed interpretation in isolation. Jonathan stepped forward again, more cautiously this time. Even if we assume authenticity, he said, we must consider intent, context, and procedural breakdown. No single file can define an entire institution. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the screen for several seconds, then spoke in a lower voice. No single file, he repeated. But this is not a single file. Emma took a small step closer to the table. That is why I brought it to you, she said. Because you are the only one in the room who can no longer pretend not to see it. The lawyers fell silent again. The earlier instinct to debate, to correct, to defend, had begun to fade into hesitation. William finally closed his eyes for a brief moment, then reopened them, as if making a decision that had been forming long before this meeting began. "Shut down external communication from this room," he said calmly. Jonathan turned toward him immediately. "Sir, that is not protocol during an active legal review." William's voice did not rise, but it carried a firmness that ended further objection. "It is now." A pause followed, then the request was executed. The room's connection indicators dimmed, leaving only the internal display active. Emma watched this without reaction, as if confirming something she had already anticipated. William looked at her again. "If what you are saying is true," he said, "then this does not end here." Emma nodded once. "It does not begin here either." For the first time, William did not challenge her statement. Instead, he looked back at the screen, where the truth continued to exist in structured silence, waiting for whatever decision would come next. The moment external communication was shut down, the conference room felt even smaller, as if the walls had quietly closed in to contain what could no longer escape. The only sound left was the low hum of the building system and the faint pulse of the display screen still projecting the internal files. William Carter remained seated, but his posture had changed. The authority he carried at the beginning of the meeting was no longer automatic. It now felt deliberate, as if every movement required conscious control. Jonathan Reed stood slightly behind him, watching the screen with a rigid focus that betrayed his attempt to remain procedural in a situation that no longer respected procedure. Emma Carter stayed near the table, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence calm but unwavering, as though she was no longer a participant in the room, but the reason the room had changed shape entirely. William finally spoke, his voice steady but lower than before. "We need verification beyond this room," he said. Jonathan nodded quickly. "I can initiate an internal forensic audit team. We will isolate the data structure, trace the modification history, and cross-reference all authorization points." William did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on the screen, now showing layers of connected metadata instead of simple documents. "Do it," he said finally. Jonathan moved toward the side console and began entering commands, his movements precise but noticeably slower than earlier. The confidence that usually defined his role had been replaced with caution. Within moments, a new presence entered the room through a secure internal call channel. A voice came through the conference system, calm and professional. "This is Daniel Hayes from Internal Forensic Operations. I have been granted temporary access to the compliance archive for validation review." William acknowledged with a slight nod. "Proceed carefully," he said. Daniel's voice responded evenly. "Understood." The screen shifted again, now displaying a structured timeline analysis of file activity. Emma watched quietly as the visual representation expanded into branching sequences of edits, approvals, and system log entries. Daniel began speaking as he reviewed the data. "What we are seeing is not a single alteration event. It is a layered sequence of controlled revisions across multiple authorized entry points. Each modification appears individually compliant, but collectively they form a non-disclosed structural deviation." Jonathan leaned closer to the table, his expression tightening. "You are saying this was engineered to avoid detection at standard review level," he said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "That is the current pattern emerging from the data." The room went silent again. William's gaze shifted briefly to Emma. "And you were able to access this without system clearance," he said. Emma nodded. "I did not bypass anything," she said. "It was already visible, just not where people usually look." Daniel paused briefly before continuing. "There is another anomaly," he added. "Certain access points originate from executive-level authorization profiles that do not match current assignment records." Jonathan straightened immediately. "That would require verification against personnel logs," he said quickly. William raised a hand slightly. "Already done," he said quietly. The words caused Jonathan to stop. William looked back at the screen, his expression now fully focused. "Cross-reference it," he instructed. Daniel complied. The display updated again, revealing a correlation map between authorization entries and decision timestamps. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was structured, repeatable, and consistent across multiple cycles. Emma stepped slightly closer to the table again. "That is why I said they thought no one would see it," she said. "Because every part of it looks normal when you only check one piece at a time." William studied her for a long moment before responding. "And yet you saw all of it," he said. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I was not looking for permission to understand it." The room remained still after that statement. No one interrupted. No one corrected. Even the analyst on the line remained silent for a few seconds longer than expected, allowing the implications to settle fully. William finally leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he processed the scale of what had been confirmed. "Continue the full reconstruction," he said. "Every layer, every revision. No assumptions." Daniel responded, "Understood. This will take time." As the system began deeper analysis, the room did not return to normal. Instead, it settled into something entirely different. Not resolution, not conflict, but investigation. And at the center of it, Emma Carter stood quietly, no longer as an unexpected presence, but as the point where everything had already begun to change. The internal forensic reconstruction continued in complete silence, filling the conference room with a steady rhythm of data updates and structured visualizations that unfolded across the main display. William Carter remained seated, his focus locked on the evolving map of revisions that Daniel Hayes was now generating in real time. Each layer of analysis revealed deeper intersections between authorized entries and system overrides that had previously appeared unrelated when viewed in isolation. Jonathan Reed stood beside the table with his arms slightly tense, watching as the structure of what they believed to be controlled documentation began to reveal patterns that no standard compliance review should have produced. Emma Carter remained in the same position she had held since the beginning of the process, calm and observant, her attention shifting only slightly as new layers of the reconstruction appeared. Daniel's voice came through the conference channel again, steady and precise. "We are now isolating secondary authorization clusters," he said. "These clusters indicate repeated validation cycles occurring outside standard reporting thresholds." William leaned forward slightly. "Explain what that means in practical terms," he said. There was a brief pause before Daniel responded. "It means certain changes were approved, then reapproved through separate internal pathways that do not appear in primary audit logs. Each pathway appears legitimate individually, but they converge on identical outcomes that were never fully disclosed in official records." A subtle shift moved through the room. One of the lawyers exhaled slowly, looking down at his notes without speaking. Another adjusted his chair slightly, as if physical movement could create distance from what was being revealed. Jonathan finally spoke again, more carefully than before. "Is it possible this is the result of system fragmentation over time rather than intentional design?" Daniel responded after a short pause. "The consistency of the pattern reduces that likelihood significantly. Fragmentation does not typically produce aligned structural repetition across independent authorization chains." William's expression tightened slightly as he processed the implication. "So this was coordinated," he said quietly. Daniel did not immediately confirm or deny. Instead, he continued the analysis. "We are now identifying temporal overlap sequences. Certain modifications appear to have been scheduled in advance of official review periods, suggesting predictive alignment with audit timing." Emma stepped forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "That is how they made sure no one questioned it," she said, "because everything looked correct at the exact moment it was checked." William turned toward her again, studying her with a different kind of focus now. Not suspicion, but comprehension forming slowly. "You understood this structure without training," he said. Emma nodded once. "I did not need training," she replied. "I just needed to see what stayed the same when everything else changed." Jonathan glanced between them, his earlier certainty now replaced by controlled uncertainty. "Even if this reconstruction is accurate," he said carefully, We still need external validation before drawing institutional conclusions. William raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to pause the direction of the conversation. External validation will confirm what is already visible, he said. It will not change it. The room fell into a deeper silence after that statement. Daniel continued working through the reconstruction, now mapping communication layers between departments and approval cycles. The visualization expanded, revealing a network of connections that had been intentionally structured to appear independent while functioning in coordination. Emma watched quietly, her attention steady. That is why it was never questioned, she said softly. Because every single part looked normal by itself. William looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. And you are certain there is nothing missing? He asked. Emma shook her head slightly. Nothing that changes what is already here, she said. Daniel's voice returned. We have completed initial structural mapping, he said. The system integrity does not reflect accidental deviation. It reflects sustained configuration over time. No one responded immediately. The weight of the statement settled across the room without resistance. William slowly leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting from the screen to the reconstructed data model and then finally to Emma. The understanding in his expression had changed again, not into conclusion, but into recognition that the structure they were observing had been stable long before they ever entered the room. And now, for the first time, the question was no longer what had been hidden, but how long it had already been visible to someone willing to see it. The reconstruction on the screen shifted again, but this time the change felt different. The structured network of data that Daniel Hayes had been building no longer expanded outward. Instead, it began to condense inward, highlighting intersections that had previously been hidden beneath layers of procedural formatting. William Carter noticed it first. His eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward, studying the central convergence point that now pulsed faintly in the visualization. Jonathan Reed stepped closer as well, his earlier attempt at procedural interpretation now replaced with focused silence. Emma Carter remained still, but her gaze followed the same convergence point without hesitation, as if she already understood what it represented before the system labeled it. Daniel's voice came through the audio channel again, slightly more deliberate than before. We are now isolating what appears to be a master coordination layer, he said. This layer does not behave like standard document revision pathways. It functions more like a centralized decision echo point where multiple approvals converge before being redistributed into separate compliance records. A pause followed as the system refined the visualization. Then the central node became clearer. It was not labeled as a single document or event. It was a structure, repeated across time, connecting multiple otherwise unrelated decisions into a consistent pattern of alignment. Jonathan's voice lowered slightly. Are you saying there is a single control structure behind all of this? Daniel responded carefully. I am saying the data suggests a centralized synchronization pattern that influences distributed outputs without appearing in primary authorization summaries. The room remained still. One of the senior lawyers finally spoke, his tone cautious. That would require a level of internal access that spans multiple departments and independent review boards. William did not look away from the screen. Or it was designed to appear distributed while remaining unified, he said quietly. Emma finally stepped closer to the table again. That is why no one found it, she said. Because everyone was looking at separate pieces instead of the place where they all meet. William turned toward her slowly. And you knew where to look for that place, he said. Emma nodded once. Not where to look, she corrected. Just what to ignore. Daniel continued the analysis, and the central node expanded further, revealing layers of time-stamped synchronization points. Each one appeared independent at first glance, but the alignment patterns suggested intentional spacing designed to avoid detection during standard review intervals. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his earlier confidence now fully replaced by measured uncertainty. This level of coordination would require continuous oversight, he said. It cannot exist without active maintenance. William finally leaned back slightly in his chair. Or it was never meant to be seen as a single system, he said. Only as many separate decisions that no one would ever connect. The statement changed the tone in the room again. Emma looked at William directly. "That is what I told you," she said quietly. "Everything looks normal until you put it in the right order." William studied her for a long moment, his expression no longer purely analytical. There was something forming behind his gaze now, not just recognition of the structure, but recognition of the implication that someone outside their system had already understood it before them. Daniel spoke again, his voice steady but more cautious. "We are detecting redundancy loops within the coordination layer," he said. "These loops suggest feedback confirmation cycles designed to reinforce existing outputs rather than evaluate them." Jonathan shook his head slightly. "That would mean the system was not designed for verification," he said. "It was designed for reinforcement." No one corrected him. The silence that followed confirmed the weight of the interpretation more than any agreement could have. William finally stood slowly from his chair, still watching the screen. "Continue mapping every connection point," he said. "No assumptions. Only structure." Daniel responded immediately. "Understood." As the system continued its reconstruction, Emma remained in place, watching the expanding visualization with quiet certainty. The network on the screen no longer looked like scattered data. It looked like intention, and in that realization, the room understood something it had not yet fully spoken aloud. The truth they were uncovering was not new. It had simply never been assembled in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The expanded coordination layer on the screen shifted again, but this time the change was not structural. It was directional. The system Daniel Hayes had built began to trace the flow of influence backward instead of forward, revealing the origin points of the synchronized decision patterns. William Carter noticed it immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly as the visualization inverted, mapping outputs back into their earliest possible triggers. Jonathan Reed stepped closer without speaking, his posture rigid, as if any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile clarity forming on the display. Emma Carter remained still, but her attention sharpened, following the reverse flow of data as if she had already anticipated what it would reveal. Daniel's voice came through the conference system again, slower now, more deliberate. "We are initiating origin tracing across the coordination network," he said. "This will identify the earliest detectable input nodes that initiated the structural pattern we have been observing." The screen dimmed briefly before reconfiguring into a layered timeline model. Lines of connection stretched backward across time, converging into a small number of repeated access points. Jonathan spoke first, his voice lower than before. "If these origin nodes are consistent," he said, "then we are no longer looking at distributed error or procedural overlap. We are looking at intentional initiation points." William did not respond immediately. His focus remained on the central cluster that was now forming at the earliest visible layer of the system. Emma finally stepped forward slightly, her voice calm but certain. "That is what I told you before," she said. "It does not matter how many layers you build on top. Everything still begins in the same place." William turned his head slightly toward her. "And you recognized that pattern without seeing the full system beforehand," he said. Emma nodded once. "Patterns do not need permission to exist," she replied. Daniel continued the analysis, and the system highlighted 3 primary origin nodes that repeated across multiple cycles of data initiation. Each node appeared to correspond to authorized internal access points, but their frequency and timing suggested coordinated activation rather than independent usage. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "These access points are tied to executive-level credentials," he said, "but the usage pattern does not match any documented operational requirement." William leaned forward slightly again, his voice quiet. "Show me the overlap intervals," he said. The visualization shifted. Overlap intervals appeared as intersecting bands across the timeline, revealing moments where all 3 origin nodes activated within the same narrow time windows. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. Jonathan stepped back slightly from the table. "This implies synchronized initiation events," he said, "not reactive processing. Planned execution cycles." No one contradicted him. Emma watched the screen carefully, then spoke again. That is why it never showed as one problem, she said. Because it was never one action. It was many actions that agreed with each other. William studied her for a long moment. And you are telling me you saw this before anyone else did, he said. Emma met his gaze. I saw what repeated, she said. That is enough. Daniel's voice returned through the system. We are now isolating communication dependencies tied to each origin node, he said. Preliminary results indicate recurring confirmation signals that validate each cycle after execution. Jonathan frowned slightly. So the system is not only initiating actions, he said. It is also confirming them after they occur. William's expression tightened subtly. Which means accountability is built to loop back into itself, he said. The room went silent again. The implication settled heavily across every person present. Emma remained composed, her presence unchanged. As the visualization continued to expand and refine itself, the structure on the screen no longer looked like hidden data. It looked like a deliberate architecture designed to repeat, reinforce, and obscure its own origin through consistency. William finally spoke again, his voice steady but lower than before. Continue tracing until there are no further origin layers, he said. Daniel responded immediately. Understood. As the system deepened its analysis, the final visible layers of the coordination network began to stabilize into a clear, repeatable structure. And in that structure, there was no randomness, no fragmentation, and no ambiguity left to interpret. Only design. And for the first time since the file was opened, everyone in the room understood that what they were witnessing was not the discovery of an error, but the exposure of a system that had always known exactly what it was doing. The final layer of analysis completed by Daniel Hayes triggered a subtle but undeniable change in the visualization, as if the system itself had reached the end of what it was designed to hide. On the screen, the origin nodes that had been traced backward through time suddenly stabilized into a single convergent structure, no longer expanding or branching, but locking into a fixed configuration that repeated across every verified layer. William Carter remained standing now, his attention fully absorbed by the central formation that no longer resembled scattered data but a deliberate architecture of synchronized decision-making. Jonathan Reed did not speak. His earlier attempts at procedural interpretation had fallen completely silent, replaced by a fixed stare at the screen as the implications became too consistent to dismiss. Emma Carter observed the same convergence point without movement, her expression unchanged, as if the final confirmation had only validated what she already understood. Daniel's voice came through the system again, but this time there was a noticeable pause before he spoke. We have completed full origin tracing across all detected layers, he said. The structure does not extend further backward. This is the base configuration. A moment of silence followed. Then the screen shifted to display a single unified map of all connected nodes, now arranged into a precise circular framework that showed no randomness, no deviation, and no missing segments. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before. If this is the base configuration, he said carefully, then everything we have reviewed is not the result of accumulation. It is the result of repetition from a single controlled design. William did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the center of the structure, where all lines converged into one repeating point that pulsed faintly on the screen. Emma stepped slightly closer to the table, her voice calm but direct. That is why it always looked normal, she said. Because it was built to look normal every time you checked it. William turned toward her slowly. You are saying this system was never meant to be detected as a whole, he said. Emma nodded once. It was meant to be seen in parts, she replied. Daniel's voice returned, more measured now. There is another layer of confirmation behavior embedded within the system architecture, he said. Each completed cycle generates validation feedback that reinforces previous outputs, effectively preventing deviation detection from triggering escalation protocols. Jonathan frowned slightly. So the system confirms itself after every action, he said, and then uses that confirmation to justify the next action. Daniel responded, that is consistent with the observed structure. The room fell into a deeper silence. The meaning of the statement did not require further explanation. William finally lowered his gaze slightly, processing the full weight of what had been exposed. "This is not documentation failure," he said quietly. "This is structural reinforcement." Emma looked at him directly. "That is what I told you from the beginning," she said. "It is not hidden because it is invisible. It is hidden because it repeats correctly every time." Jonathan stepped back slightly from the table, his earlier certainty now completely replaced by controlled disbelief. "Then every layer we have reviewed," he said slowly, "has been part of the same controlled sequence." William did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the screen, where the unified structure remained stable and unchanged, as if it had been waiting for them to reach this exact point of recognition. Daniel spoke once more. "At this stage," he said, "we can confirm that the system is fully traceable, fully consistent, and fully self-reinforcing across all observed layers." No one responded. The statement did not invite discussion. It finalized interpretation. Emma remained still, her voice softer now but unchanged in clarity. "That is why I said I know what they are hiding," she said. "Not because it was invisible, because it was complete." William stood in silence for several seconds, then exhaled slowly as he looked from the screen back to Emma. For the first time since the file was opened, the room was no longer analyzing fragments of information. It was confronting the existence of a fully constructed system that had never stopped operating, even while being observed. And in that realization, every person in the room understood the same thing at once. The truth was not emerging. It had already been running the entire time. The unified structure displayed on the screen remained stable, but the atmosphere inside the conference room had shifted into something far more irreversible. It was no longer about discovery or interpretation. It was about acknowledgement. William Carter stood still, his eyes fixed on the center of the reconstructed system map, where all coordinated nodes had collapsed into a single self-sustaining configuration. Jonathan Reed had moved away from the table slightly, his hands resting on the back of a chair, as if physical contact with the environment was the only way to stay grounded. Emma Carter remained near the table, quiet and composed, her presence unchanged even as the weight of what had been confirmed continued to settle across the room. Daniel Hayes spoke again through the internal system channel, his voice now carrying a more cautious tone. "We are preparing final structural validation output," he said. "This will confirm whether the system maintains integrity under external audit simulation conditions." William responded without turning away from the screen. "Proceed." The screen transitioned again, this time shifting from structural visualization to simulated audit response modeling. Lines of data moved in synchronized patterns, replicating external review attempts and showing how each input was absorbed, normalized, and returned as compliant output without altering the internal structure. Jonathan stepped forward again slightly, his voice quieter than before. "It is not just self-reinforcing," he said. "It is self-correcting based on anticipated review behavior." Daniel confirmed after a brief pause. "That is consistent with simulation results." A heavy silence followed. The implication was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Emma finally spoke, her voice calm but clear. "That is why nothing ever changed," she said, "because every question was already answered before it was asked." William slowly turned toward her. There was something different in his expression now. Not disbelief and not surprise. It was recognition of scale. "You understood this without access to any formal system training," he said. Emma nodded once. "Because systems always show what they are doing," she replied. "Most people just assume it means something else." The room did not respond. The lawyers who remained seated were no longer attempting to interpret or challenge the data. Instead, they were watching the simulation cycles repeat, each iteration confirming the same structural integrity regardless of external input. Daniel's voice returned once more. "We are now initiating external compliance projection," he said. "This will simulate regulatory review response under full disclosure conditions." The screen shifted again. A simulated external review panel appeared within the system, processing the same dataset. Within seconds, the system response adapted, reorganized, and reclassified the information in a way that maintained compliance appearance while preserving internal consistency. Jonathan exhaled slowly. It adapts in real time to any form of oversight, he said. William did not answer immediately. He was watching the adaptation cycle repeat itself across multiple simulated conditions, each one producing the same outcome through different structural paths. Emma stepped slightly back from the table, her eyes still on the screen. "That is why it cannot be broken by questioning it," she said softly. "Because it already knows how questions end." William finally spoke again, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "Then the only way to understand it," he said, "is to see it completely at once." Daniel paused before responding. "That is correct," he said. "Partial observation does not alter system behavior. Only full structural visibility allows comprehension." The screen stabilized once more, displaying the complete reconstructed architecture of the system in its final unified form. No additional layers remained hidden. No additional nodes were unaccounted for. It was complete. Jonathan looked at it for several seconds before speaking quietly. "If this is accurate," he said, "then what we are looking at is not a set of records." William turned toward the screen again. "It is a decision framework that has been operating continuously," he finished. Emma looked up at him. "And now you can see it," she said. William nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acceptance of the fact that denial was no longer structurally possible. The room remained silent as the system held its final state, no longer revealing anything new, because nothing new remained to be revealed. And in that silence, every person in the room understood the same truth without it needing to be spoken again. The structure had not been discovered. It had been exposed exactly as it always existed. The final system state remained locked on the screen, but something subtle had changed in the room itself. It was no longer the feeling of discovery or analysis. It was the feeling of completion, as if every possible layer of explanation had already been exhausted and what remained could not be reduced any further. William Carter stood still, his attention fixed on the stabilized architecture of the system that now filled the entire display. Jonathan Reed had stopped taking notes entirely. His posture had shifted into stillness, as if even documentation felt inadequate in the presence of what had been confirmed. Emma Carter remained near the table, unchanged in expression, but now watching William more than the screen, as if waiting for a reaction that mattered more than any technical output. Daniel Hayes spoke through the internal system channel again, but his tone was noticeably slower. "External simulation cycles have completed," he said. "The system has responded consistently across all compliance and audit models without deviation." A pause followed, longer than previous ones. Then he continued, "At this stage, we are no longer observing variations. We are observing confirmation stability." William finally moved, turning slightly away from the screen for the first time in several minutes. "Explain that in plain terms," he said. Daniel responded carefully. "It means the structure does not behave differently under any condition. Whether reviewed, questioned, or reconstructed, the outcome remains identical." Jonathan finally spoke, his voice lower and more controlled than before. "So there is no scenario where the system produces a different result," he said. Daniel confirmed. "That is correct under all tested simulations." The silence that followed was not tension anymore. It was recognition settling into acceptance. William walked slowly toward the window of the conference room, his reflection faintly visible against the glass, overlooking the city. For a moment he did not speak. Then he said quietly, "If this structure is stable under every condition, then it is not reactive." Emma turned slightly toward him. "No," she said softly, "it is not." William continued, still looking out at the city. "It is defining conditions instead of responding to them." Emma nodded once. "That is why it never changes," she said. Jonathan looked between them, his voice cautious but no longer resistant. "Then what we have been calling review and oversight," he said slowly, "is only surface activity." William turned back toward the room. Yes, he said simply. Daniel's voice returned through the system. At this point, all structural mapping is complete, he said. There are no additional hidden layers or unresolved nodes within the dataset. The screen remained steady, showing the final unified architecture without movement or alteration. Emma stepped slightly forward again, her voice calm but certain. That is what I meant when I said I know what they are hiding, she said. Not because it is hidden now, but because it was never meant to be seen all at once. William studied her for a long moment. And yet you saw it anyway, he said. Emma nodded. Because I did not assume it would behave differently just because adults said it should. Jonathan lowered his gaze slightly, as if reconsidering everything he had previously relied on. William finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. Then the real question, he said, is not how long it has existed. He paused briefly before continuing. It is how long it has been shaping decisions that no one realized were already structured. No one answered immediately, because at that moment, the system on the screen no longer felt like data being analyzed. It felt like something that had been quietly governing outcomes long before anyone in the room had ever been invited to question it. And in that realization, the boundary between investigation and implication disappeared completely. For a long moment after William Carter's last question, no one in the conference room spoke. The silence was no longer the kind that waited for information or instruction. It was the kind that followed understanding too large to immediately process. The final system architecture remained displayed on the screen, stable and complete, as if it had reached a state that no further analysis could improve or disrupt. Emma Carter stood quietly near the table, her gaze no longer fixed on the data but on the people absorbing it. Jonathan Reed remained still, his earlier role as interpreter of systems now reduced to silent observation. William Carter stood near the window, his reflection faint against the glass. The city beyond continuing its normal rhythm, as if unaware of the shift that had just occurred inside this room. Daniel Hayes spoke again through the system channel, but his voice now carried a different tone, more procedural, as if transitioning away from analysis into closure. All structural verification processes are complete, he said. No additional anomalies or hidden pathways remain within the dataset as currently defined. A brief pause followed. Then he added, the system has reached full transparency within its operational scope. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice calm but measured. Then what we are seeing is not an unresolved investigation, he said. It is a finalized structure that has always been active. William turned slightly from the window, his attention returning fully to the room. It has been operating continuously, he said quietly, without requiring acknowledgement to function. Emma stepped forward slightly, her voice steady but clear. That is why I told you I know what they are hiding, she said again. Because it was never hidden from itself. Only from the people who assumed it should look different. William studied her for a long moment. And you recognized that without being told what to look for, he said. Emma nodded. Because I did not look for permission, she replied. The screen behind them remained unchanged, holding the final map structure like a complete equation with no remaining variables. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his posture easing slightly, not in relief, but in resignation to clarity. If this structure has been active all along, he said, then every decision influenced by it was already shaped before it was reviewed. Daniel confirmed through the system. That is consistent with the behavior observed across all traced layers. William returned to the table, placing one hand lightly on its surface as he looked at the screen again. His voice was lower now but more final. Then accountability does not begin at discovery, he said. It begins at recognition. No one responded immediately. Emma remained still, watching him now rather than the screen. What happens after recognition? She asked quietly. The question lingered in the room longer than any technical output or system analysis had. William did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at the final architecture one more time, as if confirming that nothing remained hidden, nothing remained unresolved, and nothing remained uncertain within the structure they had uncovered. Finally, he spoke. After recognition, he said. You cannot return to not knowing. The room remained silent again, but the silence no longer felt like uncertainty, felt like transition. The system on the screen did not change because it no longer needed to. It had already done what it was built to do. And in that moment, every person in the room understood the same thing without needing it repeated. The truth was not arriving. It had already been here long enough to shape everything that came before it.